A team of American military leaders has just discovered an old classified document from the 1950s that reveals a secret plan to invade Canada. But why would the US want to invade their friendly neighbor? And what did this plan actually entail? It's me, and this is Air Power. While it may sound like the premise for an episode of The Twilight Zone or some other strange Cold War-themed alternate history story, this really happened. A recently declassified document from the 1950s shows that there was a real plan to invade Canada. Now, before we get too deep into this story, I want to make something very clear. This was not a serious plan. It wasn't even a real contingency plan. It was a sort of war game exercise designed to explore how such an invasion might go. But the fact that such an exercise was deemed necessary by the Joint Chiefs of Staff is still pretty fascinating. The war game in question, which took place over a period of 2 weeks in June of 1957, was titled Operation Big Step. According to a newly released summary of the exercise, its purpose was, quote, to determine the required U.S. Army strength in Canada and the probable effects on Canadian-American relations. As you can see, the exercise wasn't really about actually invading Canada, but rather understanding what such an action might look like if it were to happen. But why did the Joint Chiefs of Staff think they needed to understand what a U.S. invasion of Canada would look like? Well, the answer is simple: nuclear war. Let me explain. During the Cold War, the U.S. believed that any major conflict with the Soviet Union would almost certainly start with a surprise nuclear attack on North America. And while those attacks would be devastating, they wouldn't necessarily be the end of the world. Even if dozens or hundreds of cities were destroyed and millions of people dead, there would still be plenty of military forces left standing. And so, in order to gain an advantage over the Soviets after a nuclear exchange, the US military came up with all sorts of bizarre plans to quickly seize key territory and launch counterattacks. One such plan involved capturing large swaths of northern Canada to establish airfields close enough to the Soviet Union to launch fighter jets and bombers that could strike back at the heartland of the USSR. As retired Air Force Lieutenant General and famed military strategist John Warden wrote in his book The Air Campaign, the US military thought it could take only about 18 hours to seize Canada after a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, allowing them to quickly establish new bases in the country from which they could launch retaliatory strikes against the communists. In fact, one of the war games conducted during Operation Big Step assumed that the US would be able to reach the Canadian capital of Ottawa within just 6 hours of launching the attack. Of course, because Canada is significantly larger than the contiguous United States and sparsely populated outside of its southern border, this probably wouldn't have been as easy as simply marching troops across the border. Instead, it was likely that the US military would have had to seize airfields across the country and conduct massive airborne operations to secure key positions. This raises a pretty interesting question. Could the US actually seize Canada within just 6 hours? Unfortunately, the answer is probably yes. It wouldn't have been easy, but if the US military was willing to commit the resources necessary, they could have done it. In fact, if you've watched my video on the Canadian defense industry, you already know that Canada has a very small military with limited capability to defend its own airspace. Now, there are several reasons for this, not least of which is the fact that Canada is a relatively safe country with few foreign policy rivals and no enemies. As such, the Canadian military has never had to be very strong. Perhaps more importantly, however, is the fact that Canada is very spread out. With a population of around 37 million people, much of which lives in the southern portion of the country near the United States, the majority of Canada's military assets are focused on the southern border. This makes sense considering that this is where any potential threat to Canada would come from. However, in a conflict with the United States, Canada's air defenses along the US-Canada border would be completely overwhelmed within minutes. And with no way to effectively defend its southern border, Canada's military forces would likely focus their efforts on defending the northern regions of the country. This is where most of Canada's airfields are located, as well as the bulk of its air defense infrastructure. If the US military launched a surprise attack on Canada, it's likely that the Royal Canadian Air Force, which consists of just 18 CF-18 fighter jets, would not be able to defend these bases. And as a result, the US military would likely be able to seize them within hours. Now, while the US would face stiff resistance in seizing territory from the Canadian military, this wouldn't necessarily translate into heavy casualties. Canada's military is not equipped to fight a war against an enemy with anything close to its own capabilities. So aside from inflicting some damage to US aircraft, the Canadian military wouldn't really stand a chance. For this reason, the war game ultimately concluded that the US military could easily capture Canada and set up shop in the country from which they could strike the Soviet Union. However, this would obviously come at a cost. The joint war game estimated that the US would need to commit around 50,000 troops to the invasion force. This would, of course, divert significant resources away from the war effort in Europe, which would make it harder to contain the Soviet Union there. And it would also put a significant strain on the Canadian people. After all, even if the US wasn't trying to conquer Canada, the presence of tens of thousands of troops on their soil would undoubtedly be a shock. As it turns out, the Canadian public was extremely hostile to the idea of Operation Big Step even being considered. When news of the plan broke in the Canadian press, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker was inundated with angry letters from his constituents who couldn't believe that he would allow the Americans to invade their country. Though it should be noted that most of these people probably didn't realize that their country had literally been taken over by an invading force in the first place. As a result of the controversy, Operation Big Step was kept under wraps until the documents were finally declassified last year. But it wasn't the only time the Joint Chiefs of Staff considered the possibility of invading Canada. In another war game conducted in March of 1962, the US military considered the possibility of a surprise nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. And as you might expect, the war game once again called for American forces to seize control of Canada within hours of the first nuclear detonations. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of this plan was the role assigned to the Canadian citizens. If you recall, this was during the height of the Cold War and the prospect of nuclear war was at its peak. For this reason, every American child was taught what to do in the event of a nuclear attack. They were told to duck and cover under their school desks until the danger had passed. But in Canada, things were a little different. Instead of teaching children to protect themselves, Canadian officials opted to teach them how to survive in the wilderness for extended periods of time, presumably until rescue could come. But unlike the American plan, this didn't involve invading the country and seizing key territory from which to launch counterattacks. As far as I can tell, this was simply the best-case scenario given the extremely limited resources available to the Canadian military. Now, if you were wondering why the Canadians didn't try to defend their airspace against a potential nuclear attack from Russia, it's because they knew that it was pointless. At the time, the best that Canada could hope for was that the Soviet Union would skip over them and focus its efforts on attacking the United States directly. After all, Canada was essentially useless to the Soviet Union. There was nothing to gain by attacking the country. On the other hand, the US was a completely different story. Controlling Canada would have given the Soviet Union a significant advantage in any potential nuclear war. And it was precisely this fear that led the US military to consider seizing the country in the first place. Ultimately, neither of these plans ever came to fruition. And today, the United States and Canada enjoy a strong relationship built on mutual respect and trust. Still, it's interesting to look back at this dark chapter in history and see just how close we came to seeing Tom Clancy's The Sum of All Fears become a reality. I'm Alex Hollings. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.